right. So yeah, you were saying Metaprime.
Yeah,
By the way,
well,
I'm with Metaprime, right? I know it's hard to pretend there's an audience, but yeah, I'm with. Well, we'll get to introductions, but yeah, you were saying.
yeah. Well, no, I mean, usually when I've done podcasts, we do like a little bit of like chitty chat beforehand, kind of
Oh yeah,
figure
of
out,
course.
like the flow and what we want to talk about, and then yeah, we can do kind of like a proper thing. I mean, I've done plenty of podcasts like professionally and otherwise, so
Oh, yeah.
I know how to handle the audience isn't there, but it is there kind of dynamic. But I do think like the conversational tone is usually the best stuff.
Yeah,
So
exactly. Yeah. Any memorable podcasts?
um
I have to suss out the competition here. So it's
um I've been on the Good Old Boys a few times now.
oh yeah,
Uh,
I think I saw. Yeah, I think I saw that one. Like one
yeah,
of them. Yeah, yeah.
but love those guys, and they were very kind to me. They gave me a shot early on when I was like below 1,000 follower account. So I have a lot of respect.
Oh
Bog
yeah.
is a big patronage guy, and he's definitely earned my loyalty. So
All right. Yeah, yeah. I love those guys. I remember like because we were in the same like weirdo intersection between like people that were more friendlier to the quote unquote post left back in the day,
hmm.
and like me, Bog, a few others. Then like that sort of dissolved, and there's been like a, a weird, I guess, natural course correction when it comes to certain ideas. I noticed that like the whole the red brown alliance thing is sort of like petered out. But yeah, anyway, so um actually, what is your thoughts on that? The red brown alliance. Do you have any particular spicy takes on you know
So you're gonna find that I'm like completely ignorant to some things that go on Twitter or like the history of like a non discourse and stuff like that.
yeah, yeah.
Which is funny because like I know a lot of the big accounts, and I've kind of like carved a niche out for myself, but like yeah, all, stuff like the Red Alliance, I don't even know what that means, let alone like have an opinion on it.
Yeah, it's all right. But like those posts, I guess it's funny because like what is the post left? Like a lot of them got scared
Mm,
and they like sort of I guess like went into more well, a lot of them went to radfem spaces because radfems are kind of like politically homeless. But then you have like people like Amy Therese and I think to an extent Adam Lair, although I don't he's my boy, I don't want to pin him on
mm.
anything, but that like Amy certainly has like pivoted more towards the right wing for like, consistency reasons, which I mean it was kind of inevitable, but it's
Yeah. Well, so there's definitely like a few different topics that I want to talk with
yeah.
you about. I mean, certainly very curious to hear your opinions on these, but basically these are kind of core to after what my impetus was getting on Twitter, and then kind of how my content has evolved since then. But one of the things I'm hoping to do is start to redefine some terminology, some philosophy, some
Mhm.
ideology. It not so much by kind of forcing ideas upon people, but just redefining ideas, or you know um, capturing them in different ways that hopefully can kind of bring people together a little bit more. Because I think a lot of times we talk about people's views in kind of this left right dichotomy,
Mm.
but there is another way, and so I'm hoping that some of these ideas might break out. Who knows, like these are just kind of crazy ideas off out of my like messed up head, but
Yeah,
if
we'll touch upon it. I think because
okay.
that does play into what we'll go over the whole thing, not touch upon it, but I mean we'll touch upon the red brown thing, because it's pertinent to what you're saying. Before we get to that, I always fail to do the introduction right away, but because it's usually an hour, half an hour before it. So Metaprime, I remember, I think it was like during the CVidian era where I noticed you, where we followed each other, and what how I usually ask like how people get involved in, I guess, e-politics or sort of like this thing of ours or whatever you want to say, like is the sort of online ecologies that we find ourselves in.
Mm,
What's your origin story? Because it's very funny. Like you sort of came on, and I noticed that you were one of these like people that are a master of utilizing the new opportunities that Twitter Spaces has brought. But like, what is your origin? What are you doing? Is this like sort of another program? Are you a guru? Do you are you trying to do another Hustler University? Like, what is the what is the mission of Metaprime? Um, yeah.
No, I appreciate the question, and yeah, I'm not definitely not trying to create some sort of hustlers university. This isn't like a giant grift for me. I mean, so the reason that I got on Twitter, I think I'm pretty lucky in that I have a close friend group in my area who are very dialed in. They're very kind of realistic, practical, kind of aware people,
Mm,
and they had been on Twitter and engaged with Twitter for a while, and always had some really interesting conversations that were happening on there. And I was like, all right, look, I'm going to bite the bullet. I'm interested in getting on Twitter. Who should I follow? And so they threw out like a bunch of names. Started following like Mark Andreessen and like Battle Beagle, and
oh
one of
yeah.
my buddies was like really into the Good Old Boys podcast with Bog Beef, and uh Astral's podcast, your podcast. And so just a lot of really good content creators started to kind of tune in and follow. And to me that was really kind of an interesting space. And I think one of the big mistakes that a lot of people make when they're getting into the digital space is they end up just replicating what other people are doing, right?
Yes.
They're either
Yes.
just saying the same things, maybe in a slightly different way, or they're just kind of retweeting stuff or agreeing. And to me it was kind of like, okay, what are we missing? And I work in tech professionally, and talent acquisition specifically. So, and I have like a content that I've created in that sphere about how do you like go about finding a good career, finding a good job, self actualizing in the tech space. And similarly, I wanted to create content that was going to be valuable for people online. And about my awakening kind of red pill experience, if you will, happened in 2016 with the presidential election. Um, and it was very messy and painful, and there was a lot of kind of suffering involved going through that. I like ended up burning a lot of bridges with friends. I ended up,
Mhm.
not really knowing kind of how to do that gracefully. And so but what I realized is that there's no like guide. There's no one on the internet
Mm,
who's saying, okay, look, like you've realized that mainstream society, pushes this morality that's not really in your best interest. And they've kind of been lying to you in a lot of big ways. And
mhm.
this forces you to question basically everything, right? And like if you're questioning everything, the validity of everything, how do you where do you start trusting things again, right?
It's
Or what is
almost
that?
like a weird cogito, but politics. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And it's because you can get online, you can start learning about like anti-gravitics and like the Anunnaki and like just all of this crazy
Yeah.
stuff, right? And you're like, I don't know what to believe, right? And now you got alien stuff coming out, right? And so it's very difficult to know where to be, like where's bedrock, like what is the foundation, where should you stop? And then also I think a lot of people get kind of sucked down the like frustration, anger, depression, spiral too, right? Where because if you're kind of exposed to this, it's very jarring.
Oh yeah.
Um, and so having some sort of guide that says, "Hey, look, you're not crazy. Yeah, things are a little wonky and weird, and you've been lied to, but let's, there is a good path forward, right?" And it really starts with just like self improvement, right? Like become a stronger person, become a more knowledgeable person. Like you have this opportunity. I always tell people, like being kind of awakened to this, it's not an opportunity to like go out and fight the system and rage and stuff like that. It's really freedom from that herd morality. And you now get to decide your own path, what's important to you. And that's a very exciting thing if you think about it the right way, right? Like if you have that
Mm,
mindset, but how do you do that well? And to me, like you come on to a non-Twitter and you see like you got raw egg nationalist who's really advocating for like eating healthy. You have a lot of people who are like, go work out, right? There's you've got people giving like good dating advice and also bad dating advice.
Well, yeah,
But
mostly bad, but yeah.
but to me, it's like those are fundamental things of like go out and improve, right? Eat healthy, work out, like do all that kind of stuff. And but no one's telling you that, hey, like on kind of meta level, right? No one's telling you like
Oh, he said the thing. He said the thing. Yeah.
um it's no one's telling you that you should like go out and like first is kind of orienting yourself, right? Reading all these good traditional authors and then like going through this self-improvement phase. And then, and I'll talk a little bit more kind of in detail about the journey, but no one's giving you that kind of like orientation talk. And so that became the main focus of the content that I wanted to create, to kind of help people go through that transitory period. Since then, I've had a lot of really interesting conversations with people in the space. I have a lot of things that I'm
Yeah.
passionate about. And so a lot of other kind of areas of interest have kind of cropped up, and I've developed philosophies around that. But a big part of what I'm trying to do is make these things accessible, clear, understandable, generalized enough that basically anyone can kind of pick it up and apply it as a framework. And it's been really exciting. And I think there's been some really good positive feedback from the community around this, and really just kind of looking to move that forward and just kind of empower people on an individual level. And then ideally, I'm starting to network with more great content creators and get these ideas out, and see if there's things that we can really do in kind of service to this thing that I call the parallel movement. I mean, it's a thing that's been around for a long time, this concept of parallel movement. But I
Mhm.
think, again, if we can create terms that clearly like capture what we're trying to do, right? So talking about that idea of like eating healthy and doing all that kind of stuff as self-improvement, like a stage in the journey, the awakening journey. Or if we're talking about um the parallel movement as this kind of response to a broken system, trying to create something outside of it and giving people that clarity of what's actually happening on that macro level, then I think a lot more people can kind of understand where their goals fit inside of that broader framework. And so
Mhm.
a big focus as I'm starting to develop more content.
Well, let me say that there are a number of I think my responsibility as a podcaster, blah blah blah. There's a number of critical points that I could sort of like lay down that I think were interesting. But let's backtrack. I think before we get into the system, but also I'm curious about your experiences in tech, because it seems that the tech bro has really sort of ingratiated themselves into a lot of dissident spaces, and a lot of people have criticism of that. But let me go back to what you said originally, to the way you frame it as like the red pill experience.
Mm,
Now, do you feel that when 2016 happened, of course, I would think that even before 2016, let's say the flip switched. Like, I have this like schizo theory, by the way, that like 2012 actually did happen, but it was like in a metaphysical sense where the world went insane. Because it seems like terminal Obama period, the world did go, and like, not only the left went insane, but the world went insane. And 2012, I noticed that led into like 20. Yeah, there you go. For those who know, he's playing the Joey from Friends, where it's like, he's thinking.
yep.
That was great. Uh, but 2012 led into 2013. I remember that summer where the global left took a lot of W's, and that of course led to Gamergate. I know it's like the meme Gamergate's like ground zero of the internet, but I
Mm,
feel that my point would be that, did you feel that before, let's call it the previous, looking at, like, for example, older political talk shows from the 80s and the 90s, you have this sort of like passive liberalism of like, John Stewart era, like, we can disagree, but there's the social issues are bubbling to the surface. But it seems that when Trump happened, all of this became like, political disagreements became elevated to the context of, I would say, a social crisis. And now your direct, immediate, sensuous experience with the other becomes like this battleground of ideas. To quote my good friend and Julius, the battlefield of ideas has been carpet bombed with the white phosphorus of truth. I love that tweet. But no, do you feel like things were much different in 2016 than say when, I mean, I'm assuming we're both millennials. You know, so it's like when we were younger, it was like these political disagreements, they were bubbling to the surface, but they didn't have, I guess, they lacked the social intensity than they did before. So I mean, maybe you could, was that your experience with your friends or former friends or whatnot?
Yeah. So growing up, I grew up in a kind of a liberal household,
Mm.
and we had like NPR running in the background all the time,
Oh
and
boy.
there's which is classical music, great, I like that. But yeah, definitely a certain bent to the news, and but I didn't really pay attention to it as a kid. Right,
Yeah.
it just didn't interest me really. I mean, like the first like memory that I have of like really kind of being like, holy shit, stuff is going on, outside of my liberal kind of my little small upper middle class or middle class like lifestyle, like in kind of the suburbs. My upbringing was when they bombed it was like Baghdad or whatever. It was like when like after 9/11, and the whole Iraq war started and all that kind of stuff. That was like, whoa.
Yeah.
I remember like sitting I was like I was a swimmer early on, and I remember like sitting in like the community center after swim practice, like watching the TV as the bombs were going off, and that was pretty crazy stuff for my
That
like.
first night of bombing of Baghdad, the world really changed. Like even like I would say it was on par with 9/11. But when I remember when I was a kid, I saw that. But then later seeing subsequent documentaries of like, I remember like seeing that one ambulance driver going down the highway. And it was like that was it. Like when the bombing of Baghdad. Yeah, yeah, the world changed.
So, yeah, it was just a crazy time, and, so, like, I think, I was definitely, like, grew up on punk rock, and, like, loved, all the like, I could,
Were you
like,
into
lie.
propaganda?
Yeah, well, actually, yeah, so,
I knew it. I knew it. Yeah, they're pretty good though. They're quality. I mean, that's the best,
yeah.
really best punk that Vancouver ever produced. But yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so yeah, some weird kind of more political punk, but also just like the mainstream punk, like
Yeah,
Blink and some, but and so I was like very much there was a lot of content that was created in that sphere against Bush and the war, and so I think I like picked up that anti-war bent, because it was like cool and trendy, like that was the programming,
yeah,
and like I won't kind of sit here and lie to you that like that didn't kind of seep into me a little bit. But yeah, I mean, like I'll come clean. I just like didn't really pay too much attention to politics, right?
yeah.
When I went to college, there was still most people were liberal, but there was still a good amount of conservatives. They just didn't really talk about it openly. I think it was kind of a big blessing, is that that's like I graduated 2010, so it's like, but that during that time period there wasn't like enough, it wasn't like so kind of forefront of everyone's mind, and so I kind of got to get through that pretty unscathed. But yeah, 2012, after, so I've always had kind of like a disillusionment with broader society. Like I look at so like finance, and I think it was like after like 2008 with all the the financial
Oh
scandals
yeah.
and the crash and everything like that. I was like, a lot of my friends went into like banking and hedge funds and stuff like that, and I was just like, no, that just seems very scummy to me. I actually pursued an athletic career after college in a sport that is not very lucrative by any stretch of the imagination. It's more of a pay to play sport. And to me, that was my like middle finger to the system, right? It's like, I'm not going
Oh
to
yeah.
go out there and pursue cash and money and all these kinds of things. I'm going to go out there and do what I love to do, or at least that's what I told myself at the time. And I really enjoyed that experience. I ended up doing a lot of like tutoring and coaching of the sport in order to kind of pay the bills. Um,
And I'm
uh,
assuming you don't want to dox the sport, or else people are gonna know who you are.
yeah, it's like too small a sport to
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay.
So, um, but yeah, so like I kind of, that allowed me to stay out of like the mainstream of things for a long time. And when 2016 came along, I was definitely still on the left. Again, like this is just it. Like the disclosure here is like I just did not know enough about politics, right?
You're a
And
political normie, yeah.
exactly. But like the idea of like, hey, let's take care of everyone. You know, like we have a lot of money in this country. Like it shouldn't be going to wars. It should be staying like at home. That broadly appealed to me. It's still kind of like does. I'd much rather, you know, we spend on building infrastructure than sending money to certain war zones and stuff like that.
Oh yes.
But yeah, so I followed Bernie and the primary between him and Hillary very closely. And really what it came down to was I think what ended up happening on the Democratic side is they wanted to leverage kind of the Bernie fever, right? That was going on.
Authenticity. Yeah.
Yeah. And then like channel that into Hillary. But what they did is they created like more of a monster than they could control, that they couldn't really control. And so you had all these people who were like fervent Bernie supporters, like to the detriment of Hillary Clinton, right? Like they did not like Hillary, and but they needed these people on the left to all vote for Hillary. And so they had to get him to like bend the knee. They had to like slander him in the
You had to do
press.
the job, to use the wrestling terminology, yeah.
Yeah. And I think like for me, that was the moment, right? There was a specific story that ran on the mainstream of this Bernie supporter throwing a chair. And so they show the video and they show this guy pick up the chair and then they cut it. And then they use this as a way to say, you know, to attack Bernie and say, oh, you know, like, do you disavow violence of your supporters, this kind of thing. But I don't think they realized that like the internet was enough of a thing where the full video leaked online.
Yeah.
It was getting shared around, and the guy who had picked up the chair puts it down, doesn't actually throw it. And so to me, that was like something that my brain like couldn't just paste over, right? Or plaster over, right? It was like they not only, it wasn't like they misinterpreted something or they spun something in a slightly different way. They like maliciously clipped this video to create this fake scenario and then use that to slander a candidate. And so that was
Yeah.
the moment where I was like, things are very dirty. The media is not like spinning stuff, they're outright lying to you. And that's what kind of sent me down my thing. And I think the question that I, when after Trump won, I was kind of like, well, the media was so sure Hillary Clinton was going to win. What happened there? And so that opened me up to kind of exploring the other side of the argument and listening to people and going online. And I mean, the downside again was that I went way down the conspiratorial rabbit hole, and that's not healthy for your psyche or anything like that. So, I would have done that differently. And
Did you have any
that's
choice authors in the conspiracy realm?
I mean, just the usual guys. Like
AJ?
yeah, exactly.
Mhm.
I liked his energy and
Back
like
when he
all
was
the
still on
memes.
YouTube, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, and that was another thing. I've had some really interesting conversations with people, and I've always been really big meme guy. I think memes are very powerful ways of conveying like gnosis. Um,
Oh, yes.
and and I think like the 2016 election cycle was the establishment, right? Like evil cannot create, right? So you have
Right.
this establishment, and like they're trying to run things, but they have to react to these kind of like new strategies that are created, and they got their pants caught around their ankles when with memes, right? They just
Mhm.
like normally to battle in the sphere of power, because that's really what politics is. It's not some like fun fancy little like sideshow TV drama that happens in the background. Like it is literally the struggle of power between factions and nations and groups of people, right?
It's a
And
struggle of civilization, ultimately,
yeah,
yes.
and like usually normal people did not have a seat at the table beyond just kind of like what they could produce in kind of the voting booth or public sentiment or whatever it was. Memes gave us like a small group of awesome autistic people on the internet, like a
Mm.
real serious seat at the table when it comes to shaping ideas and public opinion and stuff like that. And like that was a complete paradigm shift in the field. And I think that was really what like kind of like really awakened me was I was on these like Bernie subreddits, and I'd see the Trump subreddit before they started to like ban it, and like try to get it off the mainstream timeline. And there'd be all this Hillary hate memes, and I was like, oh, those are funny. Like, I might not agree with Trump, but I'll follow the Trump subreddit. And then the more I was kind of following the Trump subreddit, I was like, dude,
You're
I
radicalized.
agree.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
No, but Bernie's an interesting case study because, I mean, to bring up Amy Therese again, she really hit the nail on the head in terms of calling like the more like alt sphere of a lot of like left wing media, like particularly like the dirtbag left, the Chapo people, that they're like crypto Democrats because they were all in the tank for Bernie in one sense, but yet they pulled away when Bernie had to do the job. And it's very much like this kayfabe type of thing where Bernie is like, yeah, I support Hillary because like the Republicans are evil. And then what happened was all of these like sort of, let's face it, like largely white, largely millennial men that supported Bernie, they were sort of left in the lurch and they had to conform to this new system. And a lot of them did go back to, they went to Trump. But it seems that like the Bernie experiment, I mean, her thesis is incredibly cynical that, Bernie was never authentic. He was always an agent of the sort of Democrat mafia power structure, which I mean, you could see that. But I think like a charitable take would say that, Bernie is sort of like one of these beautiful loser figures of like, falling like a tightrope walker falling down. Maybe not. No, he's not like the Nietzschean tightrope walker, but like, you get the point. I mean, he appealed to a lot of different strains of older forms of like leftist to Marxist thought that had, I would say at least, or maybe at the time, the Red Brown Alliance thing had at least a lot of validity to it in terms of the way that America had gone post 2008. And for him to like sort of bend the knee and to do the job, that was like a huge crushing blow to alt politics on the left. Whereas like I think Trump sees that moment, but of course, with the meme magic thing, I noticed the regime became much more sophisticated at counteracting these things. And they're going to do it. I mean, 2020, I think you talk a little bit about on YouTube, but they're going to do it, I mean, next year. I mean, obviously, they're going to try to plant the seeds of whatever meme potential they have. I don't know, not explicitly as the right does it. But I noticed that as time goes on, they're starting to sort of, they're sort of re-territorializing around the potential of a lot of the strategies that we've used, the frogs have used, for example, with Trump. I don't know. Maybe they're gonna meme Dark Newsom. Maybe that's going to be a thing next year. I mean,
yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, my whole take on the left can't meme as a meme, right, is
Yeah.
it's absolutely true, right? And the reason for this is that, and this is kind of a running piece of theory that kind of undergirds a lot of my other philosophies, is that what we are effectively doing is we're not necessarily the right. We
Right.
are a group of people who are just common sense, right? We are trying to be practical and realistic about the world. We're trying to create, something that where there's like mutually beneficial, right? We're cooperating,
Hmm.
working together. We're doing so in a way that's realistic, right? And true to nature. And so, for me, I think fundamentally what a lot of people on the Anon sphere are pursuing is truth. It's not right politics or left politics or whatever. It's like they just want to go after the truth and they want to be oriented towards the good. And what's beautiful about the memes that are created that have this kind of core of truth is they're more robust. Like
Right.
truth as a as like a thing is just like the most structurally sound thing that you can kind of lean on. The problem with a lot of these leftist memes, and I say this all the time, is like if you understand the way that the world really is currently, is that the mainstream morality is actually an inverted unnatural hierarchy. You have all of these people who should
Right.
not be kind of put at the top of the hierarchy, and these people are not connected with nature, right? And if you understand that they're trying to advocate for something that is effectively a lie, it's a non-truth, it's unnatural, then they just have this inherent disadvantage because they have to kind of twist and contort and go through all these mental gymnastics to justify whatever point they're trying to make. Whereas we just need to just lean into the truth and like so like we have this just inherent advantage. So it doesn't matter. And I also just don't think like they're going to be nearly as good at memeing than we are. But it's kind of like they're trying to make weapons out of plastic, and we're using titanium or whatever it
Yeah.
is, right? So
Although
it's
there
it's
was
just
that
like not a
one
battle.
guy, there was that one guy in the E-rate that tried to make weapons out of plastic, but let's not talk about that because that's let's not go there. But no, but that's a good follow up because I have this rant about nature when we get to the naturalism part. But before that, um, I wanted to ask you, like, okay, the critical point about your previous rant would be that I notice you do use the language. I think out of like, I mean, grifter is like that's like a assaulted word, but like self actualization, potential things of that nature. A lot of people, I think, like they have like a lot of people, especially in our sphere, have a very like rigid and very like let's say stone cliffed version of like what they feel to be the best way of delivering these truths. And I think like when people are naturally suspicious of like program and like sort of that type of thing because there has been a lot of grifters in the past. And even like I don't know what your opinion of Andrew Tate is, but like even the whole like seeing through the matrix thing is like that's like cool, that's cool, right? So but I think like but I guess like a critical point would be like the sort of like the methodology of it. But also I noticed that like a lot of this coalesces around the big topic of Silicon Valley and why they're so interested in a lot of like maybe not necessarily dissonant, but let's say alternative spaces when it comes to this question of truth. So, without doxing yourself, how did you get involved in Silicon Valley? What do you think is the big driving force behind why they have a very particular? Maybe it's just because they're sort of pioneers of the online world, so they have a more particular arrangement around these questions of truth and meaning than a lot of other people. And so, like, how did this happen? Like, I'm assuming like you work for a company or you freelance or whatnot.
Yeah. So, man, this is like a whole
That's a lot of
interesting
questions there,
topic.
and
Yeah,
that
yeah.
yeah,
No,
that's a
this
lot
is
of
great.
questions there.
No, but I think that this is a really important thing, right? Because there's over the last like year or since Elon took over Twitter,
Yeah,
there's been a lot of like it's all over, we're back kind of mentality in
yeah.
Twitter where people are like, oh no, he's hiring the CEO woman, like this is she's gonna like ruin Twitter again, and
She's
and
going to
then
Longhouse. Yeah.
yeah, exactly, and my
But she says semi-based things. I gotta admit, she does say semi-based things, but
yeah, I mean, my whole thing on this is that I I trust Elon to the extent that and I could trust anyone in a position of power, which is I'm
yeah.
not going to kind of hope that they're going to Deus Machina us out of like this whole situation. I naively thought that about Trump for a long time,
Hmm.
but I think that that's a little bit of an op to just kind of get people to be placated and not really trying to get out there and to be involved. I think at the very least you need to make yourself stronger. Ideally you're then taking that strength and trying to build like good communities on a local level, right? Like there's things that we can do that are positive and creative and not destructive that are going to
Right.
help what we're trying to do be successful in the future. But when I look at Elon and I look at the things like I say, okay, if I was in Elon's position where I had like a lot of money, a lot of network and power and all this kind of stuff, what would I do? Right? How, if I wanted broadly to like truth to win and humanity to win, what kind of decisions would I make? And I think that's a big thing is a lot of people on our side, I don't think they really understand the game, and that like he has to play where he has to still be like publicly beyond like scrutiny, or at least like he has to kind of play like, oh, I'm kind of in the middle or whatever it is. Part of the reason that he brought that CEO on was because he wanted to get the advertisers back, right? He wanted
Yeah.
to revitalize like faith in Twitter as kind of a platform that could be used broadly um, by the left and more moderate people. And to me, it's like my assumption when he made that decision was like, yeah, it's not the decision that if he was like hardcore, like a non right wing side, he would make. But he probably weighed all of these important factors and, and said, hey, this is a decision that I think is going to give me the best benefit. So, I'll give him the benefit of the doubt on that. And I feel like applying that broadly across the spectrum, he's been doing a lot of good stuff. Like, taking over Twitter, making sure that it's, going to be a stronger network, is he's trying to, like, as much as, there's kind of DeSantis is kind of like, there's a lot of DeSantis hate and stuff like that. Getting DeSantis to do his announcement on a Twitter space was a really like powerful way to say, like, hey, Twitter's a platform that should and
Yes.
can be taken seriously.
I mean, even
Um,
though it kind of flopped, but in terms of
yeah,
DeSantis' campaign, but not the idea though
sure.
of
Yeah. And you've had RFK on Twitter. You have,
What's the guy, Kumaraswamy? No, no, not. I had this joke that they resurrected Ananda Kumaraswamy so he could run for president, but no, what's his name? Vivek Ramaswamy. Yeah, yeah. I think he does spaces with Elon, and well, he's
yeah.
been into some controversy though with the frogs recently. But let's get that to that later. But yeah,
Yeah.
go ahead.
But, well, I was going to say, and then you got Tucker doing the videos and stuff like that. So
Yeah.
there's a lot of action in the space, right? The other thing is, like, people will talk about like Neuralink or Tesla and say, oh, like, look at that. Like, aren't you worried about him, being able to control your car, or, like, have direct access into your brain? And I'm kind of like, well,
Well, he
look,
is a transhumanist, so yeah, that is always a worry.
well, so the way that I think Elon sees this, and I wrote a thread on this a while back, because I've been bumping into these. I've been a reoccurring guest on the Mario Nafal like AI spaces, and which has been
Oh
great.
yeah.
Like, getting visibility, and someone of kind of my mentality, kind of getting to have conversations in those spaces, I think is very important. But the main point that I make there is, in the thread, was this technology is going to happen regardless, right? The Chinese are going to make it, or someone else in the States are going to make it, right? And so if it's going to be made, wouldn't you rather it be in the hands of someone who, isn't like part of the deep state, or isn't part of the Chinese conglomerate, right? Like, if I'd much rather Elon be innovating and creating these things, because I'm still not going to get Neuralink. I'm still not going to get a Tesla, right? I'm driving my, my little manual car around, and I'm very happy, like, not having anything implanted in my brain. But I think that, again, if somebody's going to make it, there's really no one besides kind of Elon or other people kind of in the PayPal mafia sphere
Hmm.
who I trust with that technology. So I think, and the same thing with AI, right? What he's doing with XAI, like, I'm not crazy that I understand the destructive potential of these tools, but like any tool, they can be used for good and they can be used for
Yeah.
evil. And I'd much rather the tools be in the hand of people who I at least have, to this point, feel like have been making the right decisions, or good decisions for what we want.
Well, what do you think of the AI debate? Like, I'm kind of in the nothing happening thing, or rather, what I mean by nothing happening, I mean that, like, a lot of adaptive technologies, I think, like, social systems are quite dynamic in some sense. I mean, unless there's a coercion, which there already is in AI. There's the whole like making AI not racist thing. But I
Hmm.
think like a lot of these technologies are adaptive, and I think, like, for example, if ChatGPT 3 could like make writers, like could make journalists obsolete, then it's like there'll probably be more of a market for opinion pieces that really can't be replicated as easily. I mean, like, in my own sphere, I mean, the big hot debate was AI art, and I'm like, well, this is sort of like nothing happening, because eventually, like, all tools of artists, they will, be adapted, and, or I guess, like, people will see through them, or I mean, certainly illustrators will be hit. But what do you think of the whole, like, I mean, who didn't Big Yud have the thing where he like wrote about, like, oh no, we have to regulate AI because it's the end of the world, and or I don't know, I'm vastly butchering Yudkowsky's thesis, but you probably know more. Have you read this, or yeah.
Yeah, well, so I think, like, when AI came on the radar for most people was when Chat GPT was coming out, and people were like, "Holy this is kind of like crazy sci-fi levels of, I can ask it a question and it'll, like, write like a very well reasoned response," right?
Yes.
And and like, so that happened, and I think very shortly after there was the whole thing with Elon where he and other people wrote like a letter that said, oh, we've got to be serious about stopping AI now. And it came out that obviously he had invested in ChatGPT, and and then they took it in a direction that he didn't like,
Yeah.
and they sold out to Microsoft and all of these kinds of things. To me, like, that was Elon's attempt not to actually stop AI from happening, because I think, again, he knows that these technologies are going to be built.
And it's
He
kind of
wants to
impossible
control
the
it.
way that, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And so that's why he's created XAIs. He's trying to pursue that. I think the huge advantage that we have here, again, going back to this idea that truth is robust, the way that current AI models work, for those who are unfamiliar with the like the mechanics, is you're effectively using what are called language learning models, right? And they
Yes.
they are farmed, they're created by farming data. And the higher quality the data, the better the language learning models are going to go. And there's feedback loops too, right? It's like
Oh, yes.
you talk about how they're like they're like de-racifying, AI or whatever. What they're basically doing
Safe
is
AI, quote unquote, safe AI. That's what they call it.
yeah.
Yeah.
I didn't know there was a state sponsored term, but yeah, that makes a lot of sense. But yeah, so they're sending it over to like third world countries, and they're having these like these people that they can pay like a couple cents a day, or
But they
like
found
go.
out Indians are way more racist than like people believe. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, so the problem is, once once you start to kind of contort the AI and make it, force it through all these filters and do all of these kinds of things, you make it much less efficient, right? You've seen the
Yes.
articles coming out about how they're much worse, that it's much worse at giving responses now, and a lot of these responses are untrue. And this is, again, a beautiful thing. It's the same thing as the memes. If we, as like the Anon group, or or Elon's XAI, if they're much more authentically kind of beholden to the truth, then that AI that's created off that kind of truthful data is just going to be that much more powerful, that much more efficient, that much more effective,
Yeah.
and in the long run is going to win. And to me, this is a core part of why the, like, we're going to make it, we win in the end, resonates with me, is because we are aligned with this kind of truth, and that gives us a huge advantage. And so, I'm very optimistic about what Elon's doing. I also think that a lot of people misunderstood his Twitter slash X acquisition, where they thought of it as kind of like, oh, he likes memeing on Twitter, so he's just going to like buy Twitter because this is
He's
like a,
buying his hobby.
yeah.
Yeah.
But what they failed to realize is Twitter isn't just a social media network. It is a data mine. It is a
Yes.
network that other things can be built off of. It's it's the public town square when it comes to debates. So many big minds have kind of, made this their platform of choice, because this is where you can have discussions. It's like the Coliseum, the arena of ideas. And one of the big things when it comes to AI is, again, that training data. And if he has sole access to Twitter slash X's data, and it can train all of his AI stuff off of that, that's going to be so much more powerful than, because I think Zuckerberg's attempt at making Threads was a similar attempt to create a network that
Mhm.
he could data mine. But the problem is, he doesn't have like smart people on Threads. Like,
No. Oh
all the
god, no.
smart people realize that Twitter's where you have discussions, and it's not just like the quantity of data, it's the quality, right? And if you have smart people having interesting, intriguing, detailed, discussions about these different things, that data that you can then gather and train your models off of is just going to be so much more powerful, so much more cutting edge than anything the competition is going to be able to
Well,
put out.
well, this is a fascinating conversation. I have a lot of questions. I have a lot of input here
Mhm.
because I mean, I'm not an expert. I mean, I don't when it comes to the math and all of that. But I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, but do they not call the way that AI works in terms of machine learning? What do they call it? Iterative intelligence, or iterative program learning, or something like, what's the industry speak? It's iterative learning, I believe.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of different ways
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
say it, so I think that's a very accurate one.
Yeah. Essentially, that like data, the way that they're programmed, like data is in some sense a blind input mechanism, but the output is learned over time through the way that, well, what is the main data output? It's the human node, right? It's the way that we feed information and the way that it can recognize patterns of information based on a certain, let's say, pool of users. Um, these are sort of like not as apocalyptic, I think, when you actually understand the mechanism of it. I mean, maybe it could turn into something, it could start to quote unquote learn, but that learning is predicated upon greater recognitions of the source material that already exists, that's already being generated by subjective or human sources. So, but you mentioned Twitter though. I mean, your pin tweet, you have an amazing thread on it. And, I come from more of like the theory cell, like Deleuze and Guattari and Byung-Chul Han and Baudrillard. Like I come from that understanding of it, in that Twitter in some ways is like a global brain because of the sort of the immediacy of its particular arrangement in terms of its open source. So for example, Facebook, people treat it as if it's their personal life. It's a enclosed system. You need to friend people. People can see public posts, of course, but it's not as intuitive as, say, tweets that go on your timeline, but go on a general timeline and hashtags and so forth. Twitter is much more open engagement, whereas Facebook, I think Zuckerberg predicated this on it being like an extension of people's everyday life, and therefore data farming can happen on a much more like mercenary corporatized level, where you can basically pick data. And, Bung Chohan talks about this, like this is dataism, where there's no real predication on the value of data, and it just becomes blind because the massification of data is all that matters now. But you're saying that Elon wants to upend this, the dataism. He wants to say that no, actually there is a hierarchy of what is useful data and what is like useless coal junk. I mean, I'm assuming that's what you're saying about data.
Yeah.
Like, so let's go over your thread, but also you have to get what is your personal engagement with Silicon Valley, again, without doxing yourself. But yeah.
Sure. Yeah. So, like I mentioned, I work as kind of in the talent acquisition space, which means I go out,
Mm.
I find the people who, specifically early stage startups, early stage tech startups, who they
Okay.
need to kind of be successful. And yeah, real quick kind of aside on recruiting and talent acquisition.
Yeah,
Most
go ahead.
recruiters are basically idiots. It's the bottom of the barrel when it comes to like IQ and intelligence. This is
Yeah.
just the way I explain this is, if you were the best like athlete that ever existed, and no matter
Yeah.
what sport you went into, you would just crush it. You'd be the GOAT. Like, you'd make the highest salary, right? You'd have all the groupies. What sport would you go into? And most people will say something like, oh, especially if they're international, they go into soccer, or,
Yeah.
maybe they go into basketball or baseball, something like that. You're not going into curling, right? It's just,
Yeah.
there's no prestige there. You're not really going to make any money. And that's kind of the recruiting is kind of seen in the tech world as like the curling equivalent, right?
Oh, I see.
It's
Yeah.
yeah, it's like, if the skill set that you would need to be a good recruiter is salesperson, you have to be ops, you have to think a little bit marketing. Like, it's like a microcosm of all of these different skill sets that usually
Yeah.
pay better, way better in other career paths, right? If I'm a really good good at the gab, I should go into sales because that's where I'm going to make my money. If I'm good at operations, I should probably go into operations and not recruiting.
There's really like two sports that come to mind that, in terms of like, that are both physically and mentally taxing, like mixed martial arts and hockey. Believe it or not, like hockey requires so much of your body and your mind that, and MMA as well. I mean, any combat sport requires like, I think people, especially nowadays in like modern mixed martial arts, like it's so much of a mental aptitude that you need to count, yeah, but that's an insight. Go ahead.
No,
Yeah.
but I agree with you that there are these kind of sports that aren't given as much appreciation as they deserve. And I think that is what
Yeah.
recruiting is, you can have a great business idea, you can have a great network, you can raise the funds, but if you don't have the right people to build that company, it's not going to be successful. And so
Yes,
you really
exactly.
need to find those people, you need to build the right culture, and that is dependent on the quality of your recruiting. And so a lot of these companies, recruiting is kind of a secondary thought to them, but the ones who really understand the value that can be driven there, they're going to think for first and foremost. And so for me, when I partner with companies and kind of work with the leadership, that's my big pitch is like, look, like, if I don't need to be good at finance, or you don't have to be good at finance, but if we find someone who's just a star at finance, we can let them take care of it, right? And that's
Yeah.
the ideal kind of startup, early stage structure is you bring in people who are competent, who you can trust to do these things. Because if you're trying to micromanage people, maybe you can get away with that at like some level, but at a certain point, as the company scales, it's just not going to be
Well,
viable. So,
it's almost like I could compare it to, say, music recruiting. Like, okay, for Zoomers out there, I mean, this is a thing of the past. This is dead now. But back in the day, record companies actually sent people out to find music, to find bands, and so it's almost like an art form where you have to intuit what the public wants, what they might go for, and the bands and the music and the talent that can actually deliver something that is innovative. Like, I know this is like totally dead because of the way the music industry is nowadays, but yeah, so it's almost like that where, but of course nowadays they manufacture everything. So there's also, do you think that talent recruiting in any sort of startup industry, there's a degree of which you have to find people that just have it, but also you're sort of manufacturing like demand of what the public wants, and those particular those particular talents can deliver on like where things are going. Like, I'm assuming, like, I remember the 2010s, like the app was everything, app startups in Silicon Valley. It seems like the app thing is gone. It's like they're
oh
moving to a
yeah.
different model. Yeah.
I mean, I have a lot of thoughts about the tech sphere and where that's going, but
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead. This is interesting. Yeah, this is very interesting to me. Yeah.
but to answer your question, right? Like what you're effectively getting at is that if you're a good recruiter, you're not trying to recruit mediocre people and just
Yeah.
kind of fill a seat. You're trying to recruit the best people. And that's a very important mindset to have as a recruiter
Yeah.
because the best people are very different than your average person. The average
Yeah.
person is kind of clamoring for a job. They'll jump through a bunch of hoops, right? They'll tell you everything that you want to know. The best people have the pick of the litter. They can go anywhere, they can do anything. And so you're much more a salesman than you are kind of this, your test giver, right? Assessment person. And so if you don't have that right mindset or that right recruiting philosophy, you're going to end up pushing a lot of these really good people away. But if you have the right mindset, that's when you're going to land good people.
Right.
And again, like there's a very big difference. I talk about this idea a lot. There's a very big difference between what I call like A players and S tier players. I don't know, maybe you're a gamer, maybe you're not, but
Yeah, the S
basically,
tier meme. Yeah.
yeah. Like that's like a cut above, but it's very similar to kind of the Pareto distribution of kind of like exponentially better as you kind of get to that top end of the spectrum where,
Yes.
an A player might be able to do a job decently well, they're competent, but they're not super driven, they're not insightful, they're not, thinking outside the box,
They
quote
don't have
unquote.
creativity in how they do things.
Yeah, and those S tier players, right? Those S tier employees, like they're going to find you, like they're going to be the salesperson that breaks into some weird niche market that you didn't know, and then just fucking blows up your company, um, or they're the operations person that creates like a new strategy for how to organize things that like super streamline stuff, or they're the engineer that like says, oh, we can write a bunch of code and we could save, like $1 million in like cloud computing cost or something like that, right?
Yeah.
These people are worth their weight in gold. And then the problem is, especially when you live in it, and like I could get into the whole like DEI equality kind of aspect of tech. That might be too much of a rabbit hole to
Huh.
discuss now. But in a situation where everyone's trying to be very equitable with pay, but these S tier people are like producing, 10 times the value for the company than, their other counterparts. And like, the difference in salary might be negligible. It's a very interesting situation. And so how do you find these S tier people? How do you convince them to join? How do you pay them commensurate with the value they're generating with the company? I think a lot of like this is people who are oriented towards truth, more robust, people who are kind of living in this fantasy lie world are just going to kind of miss the boat. I think there's a lot of opportunity in tech to be much more realistic about how things really work. And if you can be the tech company that's paying that understands that there is a huge difference between A and S tier employees, and paying the S tier people appropriately for the value and giving them the agency to do these things and all that kind of stuff, like that's a game changer. So,
Yeah.
yeah, tech and recruiting is really interesting. I mean, you mentioned the app stuff. Like there's if just kind of like broadly speaking, there's a whole bust going on in tech right now.
Hmm.
And it's been happening for a while. You saw huge layoffs at like, Facebook, and even, Twitter was kind of like the first one to do it. And this dovetails nicely with the whole AI thing, because I think basically what's happening with AI is, it feels a little bit like a nothing burger. It's like a lot of
Hmm.
people are like, oh, cool. Like I can use Chat GPT to answer these random questions. The real game changer is when these AI tools start to be integrated in with kind of existing tool sets. So, for example,
Yes.
you have Google Workplace, right? So you think of like Docs and Gmail and Sheets and all of those, and like slides and stuff like that. When AI is integrated in that, and you can say, like, you can just auto generate emails, or you can say, hey, take this email chain and summarize it, or you can say, hey, I have to write this proposal for this idea, like pull from my email and other docs and create like a proposal, right? And it could do that for you. That is huge, because right now a lot of people aren't leveraging ChatGPT because of this thing. It's called friction, right? It's like it's really
Hmm.
hard to move from wherever you have your data or your idea stored into ChatGPT and back again. And so a lot of people aren't using it for the day to day to like, fast write emails and stuff like that. But once it's integrated, everyone's going to use it. This means that you're going to get a huge bump in efficiency out of a lot of people.
Right.
And with that bump in efficiency and also an economic downturn in the tech market, there was a lot of investment when the Fed was printing money back at the end of 2020 into the end of 2021. The tech industry became bloated, and the single biggest cost for a tech company is the people cost. And
Yes.
so for them, this is a huge win, because they could just start cutting people left and right, especially when, again, if you hired, like, trying to fill certain quotas and stuff like that, you probably brought in a bunch of people who were not only not really producing for the company, but might have actively been hampering your ability to produce effectively. And so I think we're going to see a huge, or we have been, and we will continue to see a huge culling in tech. But again, that leaves a lot of room for people who are those S tier candidates, because I think what AI really enables you to do is produce things quickly, but you still need that architecting. The analogy I use to explain this is, if you're building a building, right, and you have a bunch of machines and robots that will like actually put the building together for you, right? You don't need those on the ground construction workers, but you still need the people who are saying, we should build the building here, and we should include this number of bathrooms, or we need, it should be this tall, or can negotiate with the local officials to make sure we're getting the building permits, right? Like, there's all of these things that need to happen outside of the actual construction of the building, but
Yes.
that's going to be streamlined. And so you're going to see a lot of kind of the bottom and middle of the ladder tech jobs just kind of disappear, because a lot of the work that they do is repeatable, busy work, like the laptop class, the fake email jobs are going to get a significant hit. But it's the architecting, strategic, planning jobs that are going to be empowered by this. And so if you're in that position, or you want to get to that position as quickly as you can right now, and I can't even begin to think how kind of the Zoomer
Yeah.
generation is going to fare looking into the job
Yeah.
market. And I think colleges are just a kind of a huge joke, because they're so far behind the times of how the career world is shifting. And yeah, it's going to be a huge mess, but it is a very interesting kind of thing to see play out, because we are kind of getting on an increasingly accelerated timeline with this stuff.
Well, would you say that creativity in terms of what you're looking for is subjective, based on the needs of a particular venture, based on what the market demands, based on like the skill set that's required? Like there is a level of subjectivity, I guess, with recruiting. Um,
Yeah, the way that I assess people is, there's that kind of idea that floats around that like IQ is something that's can be measured very consistently.
yeah.
You can see it across things, and that's a big part of what I look for is IQ. And the way that I assess that is, I think how you do one thing is how you do everything, right? So how
Yes.
you live your life, how you orient yourself. So when I have conversations with candidates, typically what I ask is like, what are you trying to do with your life? What do you want to do with your career? What's important to you? How do you see the market, right? Like, and if they have very weak answers to this, of like, oh, I just really kind of want a job, and I know that that person's not S tier. But if that person's like, well, this is how I see the market and this is what I'm excited about. And these are the things that are important to me. And this is what I want to do. And I was inspired by this author and I love this book. I'm like, yeah, this is the person that I want, because they're, again, going to be on that S tier of creativity and stuff like that. And I think I was going to mention this earlier. There's a very big difference between people of different intelligence levels, right? It's not just like,
Yeah.
oh, I can do math a little bit better. I can remember things a little bit better. And I think that this is something that I had to learn, because again, our society really tries to enforce this idea of, everyone's on the same level and different opportunities. And that's what's caused inequality. And it's like, no,
Different socialization and poverty and class issues and heck and some class issues, yeah.
and if you're
Because
trying to
we know that
communicate,
that's also saying that like poor people can't behave morally, which is kind of a defeating blow to the left argument. But that's another issue. Yeah, go ahead, Metaprime. Sorry.
yeah, no, it's good. But yeah, so for me, it's like, if you can understand how to identify people of that kind of like higher thought capacity, that higher intelligence level, right? And kind of weed out the people who are just kind of like, blindly meandering without really kind of that sense of awareness. Like that's probably the most powerful filter. And I try to apply
Yeah.
that early. But especially when interacting with people online. One of my good mutuals, Schizo Freak Lucas, we've had a bunch of conversations. The guy is like literally brilliant. He's one of the smartest people out
Oh,
there. And
really? One of the best posters. Like
oh
he has
yeah,
mastered posting. Yes. Yeah.
his content is so fantastic, because I think
It
good
hits all the
content.
right buttons, really,
Yeah,
into getting engagement in terms of like it hits a primordial spot within most people. Yes.
yeah. I mean, I think people who are good at content creation do this thing. I call it multifractal information, right? It's if you
Yes.
put out an idea and it resonates with different types of people on different types of levels, but it all but it still resonates powerfully with them. And I think that's really what Lucas is great at, is he can put out these really kind of, to your point, like these engagement tweets that are also kind of getting you to think, or and I think like that's a really powerful thing. But
Yeah.
one of the things he said, man, did I lose the thread? I might have lost the thread here. Well, yeah. So one of the things he said was, you can really tell people's intelligence by their ability to grapple with ideas, right? If you get
Yes.
people into a space and, you throw out an idea and they're able to kind of work with it on the fly and play
Yeah.
around with it and be, quick on the uptake with the response, like that's one of the key ways that you can really tell that intelligence. And so I try to, when I'm interviewing candidates or just talking to people generally, is throw out very kind of like open-ended, thought-provoking questions that they're not going to expect, that they can't prepare for, and just see where that conversation goes. And I think like that has been a very effective way of kind of understanding that for me.
I remember a professor I had once said that, and he was a professor of phenomenology, so this is probably what he said it. There are people that, like most people, for example, in academia, they are in between a thought. But there are a lot of people. I mean, there's a lot of people that are in between a thought. There are very few people that have a completed thought but can verbalize that completed thought. And I think that's probably what separates the midwits from people who can grasp the source material of their given field and can generate ideas from that. Like even just the simplest thing, like like my meme idea is becoming a whole book now, a neoliberal kitsch. So it's like I didn't actually come up with it. Like Thurston Botts Borstein, the art critic, said it, and I'm like, well, that immediately clicks. Like, how do you analyze like left driven art and illustration in the 21st century? Then this becomes a meme, then people, you see it everywhere. But one criticism to track back, I wanted to run by you, because you know this. I remember one time there was a Schwab space, and he said how, you shouldn't doom post over AI and machine learning, because if, for example, if you were a content creator or like I guess a journalist, whatever, even though it's a dirty word, and you could summarize text, even esoteric texts, within a framework that's very easy and accessible, that would do your job way easier. You could then complete a thought, right? But my issue would be, I mean, I know Spandrel talked about the IQ shredder, but my issue would be that if we rely on this sort of, let's call it extra human mechanism to summarize knowledge, would there not be knowledge gaps within the framework? Would that not contribute to sort of a streamlining or refinement of people that are not just doing tech jobs, but let's say very subjective fields, either in philosophy or journalism, or um, even within like mainstream sources of knowledge in professional outlets, right? Would this not contribute, I think, to sort of a paradoxical descaling because people are relying on the summarization of knowledge through AI rather than a sort of immediate sensuous grasping of the material that comes with a very close and hard slog of reading these things. I mean, but is there a way around it? Like not just a trust issue with AI, but also the element of knowledge and the sort of creation of knowledge that is almost kind of like an art form. At least that's
Yeah.
how I approach it. But yeah, go ahead. That's a long question, but
No,
yeah.
you hit the nail on the head. And this is another thing that I've brought up in previous AI threads is AI is basically it's doing the intermediate work between taking like a very condensed thought and
Yes.
like you say, like write an email that does this, right? And then it writes a long form email or
Summarize this book. Yeah.
summarize, right? So it's basically condensing and expanding information. And like that's all well and good, but we have to trust its ability to do that, right? Because
Yes.
there's this weird kind of under the hood black box that we're not really understanding. And again, this is the danger of putting AI in the hands of those who kind of want to push a certain agenda, right, with the answers that the AI is giving off versus following truth. And again, this is why I'm a big proponent of what Elon's doing with XAI, really pursuing truth. Or open source AI is also going to be very strong, right? Because
Yes.
you can use it on kind of the information sources that are actually trustworthy versus the ones who aren't. But your point that like can we trust that compression and decompression of information? It's a critical thing. It's very similar to how we kind of currently use like Google Maps, right, to
Yeah.
navigate or ways to navigate, where we're kind of trusting that thing to give us the right answer. But we're also over time losing our ability to read a map and to make smart decisions on how to navigate a certain area or those kinds of things. And so we
Yes.
are this is kind of the inherent problem with technology is the more systems that we create, the more complex things get. Yes, it frees us up to think about other things and not have to worry about, mapping out a route, but then we lose that ability to do that. And if that becomes like a core pillar of society, this AI's ability to compress and decompress, but someone at some point, maliciously tweaks that, or not even malicious, it doesn't even have to be maliciously, that could be a huge kind of like keystone falling out. And so, yeah, I think that we have to be very careful about that. And that's why I think that this kind of transparent, truth driven AI is really important. But another kind of point that I bring in when we're talking about, we'll get to it eventually, talking about
Yeah.
naturalism, is that the kind of the question that's in front of people right now, what's very interesting about AI is it's not just a bunch of like tech bros talking about like how does AI work. There's a lot of philosophical debate around this. There's even a lot of spiritual debate of like what is
Oh yes.
consciousness and what constitutes consciousness. And I think that the main question that AI is kind of forcing humanity to ask is, if we have this power to do all of these things, right, with technology, what should we do with technology? Is there a line, right? And
Yes.
my argument is that we need to be as kind of naturally grounded as we can. I think you were kind of talking about this idea of training data, and to me, what we really want to do is we want to train all of these systems off what is true, right? What is
Hmm.
naturally true. Because if we're training the systems off what isn't true, right, and we create these kind of detached artificial realities and live in that, like on a spiritual perspective, we're kind of disconnecting from God. But on a just kind of like a material, if you just express this materially, right, one of the ways you want to think about it is like life is kind of like a video game, right? And if you run into challenges or difficulties, right, you need to learn how to solve those challenges or difficulties. And life gives you like the real challenges, the real difficulties. But if you go into like an abstract digital, subjective truth space, you might wash out a lot of those real world challenges.
Yeah.
And if you're continuously playing this game in this kind of made up reality world, you're never going to learn how to deal with those challenges, with those difficulties.
You're conforming to a different set of challenges, in other words.
Yeah. And so if you come back to the real world, like technology ends, or, or you kind of are forced to kind of deal with real life things, and you don't have that skill set, right? You're pretty boned, right? So,
Yeah.
So that's why, in my mind, like, we need to have this real discussion, because, we live in a time where you have to elect to take challenge into your life, to live in the real world versus the digital, fake reality. And I think that is a question that every person on an individual level is going to have to answer, right? How do I want to live my life? And I would encourage people to think about, well, how do you stay true to kind of that natural environment? Because that's how you're going to really develop as a human being.
Yeah, and I think I know I'm starting to piece together, I think, why you've gravitated towards Twitter, being in the industry that you are. You mentioned Lucas, and he's a good example, but there are many others where
Mm-hmm.
when you have this, I think, engagement towards truth that is also the ability to transgress against norms, but to also have multisyllabic forms of information that you can put in a very small space of a tweet, but also have an engagement where it just hits the right nodes in people's brains. I think that's almost like being a poster nowadays, given the sort of digital world, is almost similar to like what these, top Silicon Valley companies and other sources of knowledge are sort of looking for. But like the fact that the poster can synthesize and project information, but also create new forms of knowledge, like that's also, I think, very scary and dangerous to a lot of people that don't particularly want to foster that ability, because we need to live in like a nation of worker bee NPCs, in other words. So it's like almost like what you're looking for is kind of like what a good poster is, right? To separate the coal from the gem. I think it's probably like what you're looking for. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think again, you kind of hitting the nail on the head. For me, I think that the mainstream society kind of it kind of projects a framework on the way that you see the world, right? It forces you
Yeah.
to look through the world in a lens, and this is a big thing, right? This is a very simple explanation of this: is you turn on the news, and sure, they'll spin a certain story, and you can be like, oh, that's disinformation, but they also made a decision to like show that story over other stories, right?
Yes. Yes.
And so there's like decisions that are kind of hidden in the way that they're presenting this information to you, that you aren't consciously aware of, right? And I think that this is similar to the way that we look at the world, the mindsets that we have, right? And if we can give people other ways of looking at the world that then bring other things, like bring the kind of important things that we want them to pay attention to more into contrast, right? They're more easily identifiable. Then that empowers people in a way that I think the system that wants this kind of worker bee mentality doesn't want to have happen. And so we have a lot
Yes.
of power in this kind of intellectual space to redefine thought, to redefine ideas, or to capture ideas in kind of new ways that really could, seem kind of like, it's like, yeah, we're just playing around with words on the internet, but those are the ways like that really mindset shifts happen, right? There's this saying that the consciousness of the world is rising, right? I very
Yes.
much believe that, and I think a lot of that consciousness rising is happening on Twitter. You mentioned my pin thread, and I call it kind of the Great Gathering, or the lighting of the beacons. To me, so there's this recruiting like story of or a question that sometimes gets asked of like, okay, you and a friend are meeting in New York City, but you have no way of contacting each other. So you're out there on the same day. How do you find your friend? And the answer should be you go to Grand Central Station at noon. And the reason for that is Grand Central Station, central location, noon, makes sense. It's like the middle of the
Yeah.
day. It's very easy and accessible to get to, right? And I think Twitter is like the Grand Central Station of like everyone who wants to have discussions about ideas.
Yeah. They'll always be there at a certain
Mhm.
time. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and so, well, it's because this is where it's happening, right? This is if I'm like an individual person and I'm like, I want to have interesting conversations with people about these different ideas. I want to engage in people who are passionate about these things and trying to make a difference. Like, where do I go? Twitter just is clearly the answer in my mind, right? It's where you
Mhm.
have the intellectual discussions. And so you have people coming, okay, now how do we identify each other, right? And kind of understand what we're trying to do and all this kind of stuff. To me, that's what your content is. As you're putting out content, you're sure you're educating people and you're talking about ideas, but you're also kind of lighting a beacon, or you're sending out a certain wavelength or frequency that people who resonate with that will be able to see, right? They'll
Yes.
gravitate towards that, and that's how you kind of have this amassing of groups. Um, and I think that the quality of the content, right, goes towards that IQ, creativity kind of thing that I was talking about earlier. Right, there's a common like thought on Twitter that, if you are going to make it, it's only a matter of time, right? You come on, you're diligent about creating content and that kind of stuff. Like,
Oh, yeah.
if you're good, people pick up on that pretty quickly, and you get invited into the group chats, and they'll boost your content, and all of that kind of stuff. So I think
Or you can, like, petty engagement farm by starting drama or posting coal, or yeah, there's ways of hacking it, but yeah,
yeah,
the true posters will rise to the top and will gain a level of both fame and infamy than people that, like, m let's say, manufacture their own success by less than savory means.
sure.
Yeah, I
I mean,
believe in the purity of content, but yeah.
yeah, no, I definitely try to stay away from the drama stuff. It's funny. I've actually like repaired some rifts between certain Twitter personalities, because in my mind, we're all kind of trying to work towards the same thing, right? We're all
Yes.
trying to get people to realize what's really going on, to have these mindset shifts that are going to put them in a more positive headspace, that get them to focus on taking on responsibility for themselves, and then hopefully then being able to kind of improve the world around them. And to me, those kind of differences of opinion, that's fine. Like, I'm cool with a biodiversity of strategy, right? Different kind of approaches,
Yeah.
because some of them are going to work for certain groups better than others, or they're going to be more effective or less effective. And who am I to say that like somebody else's strategy of how they post or what they put out there isn't going to work? I'm much more of someone who, like, I just want to kind of focus on creating the content that I think is valuable, and then the people who resonate with that, like, awesome. That's
Yeah. Well, literally, a poster can determine the engagement of a whole day's worth of news cycles. I mean, even if it's like less than savory, like my good friend Billy Pratt, my good friend Bizlet, they really they did more for the Barbie film than anybody by posting the Margot Robbie as mid meme. Like, literally, like, this made to Newsweek, it made it to the New York Post. Like, you see tweets by Billy and Mommy Milkers on there. It's like really quite funny. But I think, like, a positive spin would be that, yes, the anon poster. I mean, I wrote this whole article recently about it, but the anon poster can really, I think, transgress enough to get people's attention and just sort of like deter. Like, I remember, like, and listen, okay, I don't exactly agree with this guy because, I mean, he's got a lot of takes I don't agree with, but I remember when Wyatt did his video games and anime voices threads where they were trying to, like, do the dubs of anime voices to be more like Western politically correct. And then near the end of the thread, and he got like this huge engagement. This is before Elon, so he was like banned immediately. It was about like a certain, issue of Impossible Women, and it was like it basically determined the news cycle for like a week.
wow.
And it's like, that was really powerful. That was really a feat. But I think a criticism would be that I know, like, this is a big debate in our sphere, but when you say that, okay, yes, individual content can rise through, but also your emphasis on self improvement and improving of one's life and ability to discern truth, but also to discern truth of the body, for instance, a lot of people would say, well, that's not really a political movement. That's like, they'll say that, RIG, for instance, it's like, at the end of the day, who cares? Because it's not going to restore order. It's just going to, make like small piecemeal improvements to on an individual level rather than sort of like a grand political strategy. So, like, what would be your criticism of that? Like, being hit with like, well, actually, you're not doing anything. You're not doing like actual activism. This is just like, self help stuff. It's not real. Yeah,
Yeah, well, the way I see it is, if you were part of like a Navy SEALs team going in and combating the enemy or something like that, you
yeah,
want to have people around you that you can rely on,
Yeah.
right? And
Well, this
and
is like the Jocko Willings thing about being a Navy SEAL. Yeah, yeah. But yeah, go ahead. Sorry, I just derailed your point right there with the Jocko Willings.
you're good.
Go ahead. Yeah.
But yeah, so like you want to have people you can trust, right? In the sphere around you. And look, like everyone's on a different level. Everyone can
Yeah.
contribute
Yeah.
in a different way. And if we can just get people to like even just buy into like the, eat healthy, work out, try to pursue a good career, try to build relationships with your family and your community, like, all of those kinds of things. We just make more reliable individuals, right? That
Oh
energy,
yeah.
that positive shift will kind of snowball and cascade into something larger. And again, information is multifractal, right? So if I'm sitting here and I'm saying, hey, yeah, do all these self-improvement things, ideally the people who are kind of like capable of that higher level thought are like, oh yeah, I could apply, taking control of my life in kind of a health capacity to taking control of my life in a career capacity and in a family capacity. And then, I could apply that to, the world around me more broadly. And so I think that is where you need to start again. So this might be a good chance to transition into the journey,
Oh yeah.
which is a big part. So you go to my website, I have a few different kind of tabs. One of them is the journey. It's the 5 steps of the awakening process, right? And you start with awakening, right? That's that realizing that, the Bernie bro didn't throw the chair moment, right? The media is lying to you, that gets you to start questioning things. The second step is you have to rebuild your framework. And we see this a lot with, people who you get really into Nietzsche or other philosophies. Really what they're
Hmm.
trying to do is they're trying to understand, where's the foundation that I can rebuild my framework on? Where's the truth? This is what, I know Peterson's kind of fallen off a cliff a little bit in recent times, but for me,
Yes.
he was a very pivotal influence, because he basically instilled this idea of like, look, there is some value to society, right? There still is a way to kind of work up to that. There is value in taking on responsibility. There's meaning in that. And that really resonated with me, right? Because I was kind of pretty like depressed and pessimistic about everything. And hearing that was really encouraging. And so, rebuild that framework as accurately as you can. The other thing is, you don't have to go all the way down into the deep dark recesses of the conspiracy or theory rabbit hole to build your framework, because
Hmm.
whether aliens exist or don't exist, that shouldn't really affect your decision making on a day-to-day level, right? So like what you should need to focus on is yourself, right? And so that's the next stage, is once you've built your framework, you move on to self-improvement, right? And so that's, becoming stronger, healthier, career wise, socially. The next step after that is creativity, right? So this kind of goes hand in hand with what I was talking earlier about, like lighting the beacons, right? Putting yourself out there. Creativity is a way for other people to recognize your capacity, what you think, what's important to you. It also helps you develop your own philosophy. I think this isn't appreciated as much, but for me, the reason that I can talk about a lot of these things is because I've sat down and like written about them, and I've talked about them. And so it's the Feynman, the Feynman technique of like, the better you can explain something, the better you understand it. And so
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
creative process is really healthy to shaping your own internal understanding. And then the last step is world improvement, right? Like, now that I've made myself into this stronger, more capable person, and I've really, defined and structured my ideas, how can I then push that out into the broader world? How can I become the strongest version of yourself and then share that with the world? So that's the final step. And you're still constantly looping through, like updating your framework and, still working on self-improvement and creativity. But it's like, as you can't, it's that the Jordan Peterson idea of like, clean your room before you try to fix the world.
Mm.
That
Yeah.
progression needs to happen in that order, because if you're and this is a common mistake with a lot of anons, is like, they go through the awakening period and they're like, oh, I see it so clearly now, I can just convince everyone around me that this is the way things are. And then they end up burning a lot of bridges and kind of, messing things up. and
Yeah,
and
impurity spiraling, and yeah, now the old
exactly.
heads have to go. And um but you mentioned Jordan Peterson. I think like, and it comes from his knowledge of psychoanalysis, where I mean, even as a Jungian, he still, I think, internalized some of the Freudian. I'm particularly thinking of civilization as discontents, where if you destroy or if you upend, even not destroy physically or outwardly, but inwardly destroy sort of like the social superego around you, it can lead to sort of like either nihilistic despair or a disruptive antigen within the social that isn't really going to improve things in the long term. So you have to still integrate what is outside of you. But to do this effectively, I guess you could say like there should be like a degree of psychic shielding from the sort of negative aspects of the social or the super ego that's outside of you. Because if you just tear down and destroy, I think like that's what Jordan Peterson's like big thing. Well, before he went insane, like a lot of young men feel lost and therefore they'll literally like they'll burn the saying like they'll burn the village just to feel warmth when they've been rejected by it. They'll burn the longhouse just to feel warmth,
Mhm.
right? So but I think unfortunately with Peterson this sort of devolved into gatekeeping and like not leading men to realizing other truths that maybe great with the consensus of whatever his sort of bricolage of ideology is within like the very narrow liberal framework. But I do sense that like a lot of people, like you were saying, they don't get past the red pill stage and they OD on red pills and they sort of become a sort of like a destructive or inwardly destructive force and they don't really like see the forest for the trees. And I think like how do you guide people out of that? I mean, I know Jordan Peterson had a very like sort of like milquetoast way of guiding people out of that, but like from your opinion, how do you prevent people from just tearing everything down? And maybe in a sense, we do need to tear everything down, but millions, never mind. But like um, how do you prevent sort of like this inward like how do you prevent people from becoming a chud jack where it's just like nihilism and misanthropic hatred of everything? Like how do you do this?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a great question. And I think like that
Yeah,
is again going back to what we were talking about much earlier, this idea of defining what is happening on a meta level such that people can know how to orient themselves. And so I wrote an article a while back, and this is up on my website, which is Live Not in Opposition to Evil, but Pursuit of Good. Right.
yeah,
And I had said earlier, like what really the awakening is this realizing you no longer have to be beholden to the herd morality, right? You can define it for yourself. And I think really what you need to do if you want people to kind of move past, you call it like the second matrix of like just kind of stuck hating the system, move past that, it's give them something to create. Right? Give them something to believe in that we can create together. And that's why I think that the terminology parallel society, right? Creating these parallel movements, right? You see this with like crypto as a parallel movement to fiat currency. What we're
yeah,
doing here, in the Anon space is a parallel movement to kind of the mainstream news and information. What Ren is doing with, man's world and stuff like that, that's a parallel movement to health and eating and stuff like that. And so what we're effectively doing is we're building these alternative communities that are creating much more truthful and robust frameworks, with the hope that as the system collapses, or the parts of the system that are kind of, again, that truth is inherently strong, lies are inherently flawed, as those kind of lies crumble and fall apart, we need to have something. And so there's a lot of people that say, yo, we're on this downward curve. And I'm like, sure, you can think about it that way, but we're also kind of overlapping with the upward curve of whatever's next.
yeah,
And so I think that if people have that mindset of we're going to make it, like, first you got to work on yourself and improve what you're doing, but then you can contribute to building these parallel movements, right? And there's so many of them. You can find what resonates with you. You can get involved in the right way. But that's how I would kind of instill kind of the right mindset in people. I still think that there's a lot of value to ridiculing the mainstream. I'm very much of that kind of Joseph Campbell's hero's journey, master of both worlds kind of mentality
mm-hmm,
of like, you
mm-hmm.
have to live in the mainstream society as it exists, but you can also live in this alternative kind of higher parallel movement at the same time. And I think being able to exist in both worlds is really the challenge that a lot of Anons have. And because again, you see a lot of people who burn bridges with their normie friends, and or like and that was a big problem for me, is I lost some really close friends. I kind of,
Mm,
made things a little bit difficult with my liberal parents going through my stuff. And since then it's been, how do I repair that? How do I exist, in both worlds? And if I can kind of share, strategies to help people do that a little bit more effectively, I think that's a huge win, because we can't have people just noping out of society. We can't have people getting pessimistic and thinking it's all over, because those people aren't going to help create, what comes
right.
next.
Yeah, no, exactly. And well, it's like younger Xanarch, right? Like you're living in the world but not of the world. I mean, that's sort of like a fundamental lesson. But I noticed that there is a lot of like energy in this way of thinking, but yet it's like it's very hard to formulate anything that just challenges the mainstream, because when you look at things as an avant-garde rather than say a movement, I mean, this is a very difficult thing because there are limitations to it. There are limitations to the power of which you can post your way into a new idea space. But I mean, it percolates over time. But at the end of the day, I mean, there are a lot of people who are saying that, well, actually real world political activism, especially in North America for some odd reason, is like kind of hopeless, given like the experiences of all those names and dates that I probably shouldn't say on YouTube, but it's like there is a challenge there. And so I think like there has been like a very severe inward turn and a sort of reevaluation of what our values are in general, rather than this like grand idea of like, and Trumpism, I think, was a curse and a blessing in the sense of it gave us an it gave us a context by which you can integrate these things. But now that that's sort of petered out, I mean, hopefully next year, who knows what's going to happen? It's going to be interesting either way with the election. But I think like that sort of mindset ran into a number of severe limitations for obvious reasons. And the
Yeah.
regime itself has like, found ways to manage this sort of dissent. But yeah, go ahead, Matt. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. I mean, you make a good point. And I was talking to, one of my mutuals about this, and really we attended kind of like a conservative event, that was not sure.
NatCon?
No, different thing, but
Okay, okay, okay.
no, I try to stay away from kind of like the, I don't know, I'm sure you saw the like the event that happened in New York, and it just seemed like a bunch of, what's
Oh
the
yeah.
what's the right word here, I'm totally blanking on what the right word here is. It's just like a, not hippie. Well, what's the
Hipster.
hipster? Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
It seemed kind of like it had like this undertone hipster vibe, and and I think like a lot of Anon saw that and they were like I don't know. But to
They
be
were
fair,
pretty
is
vicious. They were
yeah,
pretty yeah, yeah.
yeah, and it is in New
Yeah.
York, right? So like you're gonna attract a certain type of people, but
Oh yeah.
I think like if you really want to be part of something that's gonna be powerful, you can't. It's like we like I'm not a huge fan of the idea of like gatekeeping people out, because I
Yeah.
think that if you do that, you're inevitably going to push people out of the space who could have been very productive and beneficial. But at the same time, I do think you need to have, especially at an earlier stage, a lot of discernment for who you bring in, because again, going back to that Navy SEAL idea of like you want a strong group of people around you. If you have someone who's like OPSEC is not very good, right? And they like tell someone, something that becomes doxable or something like that. Like that's very dangerous.
Oh yeah.
And it's not malicious. They're not like glowing or anything like that, but it's just they haven't kind of gotten wise to the way to kind of interact in that world. And so I think you do need to be yeah, pretty smart about that. But if we're kind of talking about um politics, I think one of the big problems in mainstream politics is it's largely driven by incentives. I say this
Yes.
all the time. It's like, if you want to understand how people are going to act, you just think about the way that the system works and what the incentives are. And it's very hard for Anons to affect, um,
The
you know,
incentive structures.
yes, exactly. Sure, we can meme and we can do all these kinds of things, but I think we're much more like we're going to get more bang for our buck doing things at more of a local level, right? Trying to create, like, I think if you create an ideology, like, and hopefully we'll transition into talking about naturalism soon.
Yeah.
If trying to create naturalism as kind of a concept, if that actually is successful in pushing out and shifting the paradigm of the way that people think, that's going to be vastly more effective than if I was like knocking on doors campaigning or trying to work my way into like a presidential staff group or all of those kinds of things. And so there's huge return on investment opportunities for anons that aren't kind of engaging with the mainstream, because that game is just it's so hard to play unless you have a lot of money.
Yeah, exactly. Unless you're anti-fragile in some sense, unless you could survive being doxxed or whatnot. But yeah, and there's a lot of people who've been burned. I mean, even people that have worked at higher levels who are like friendly to frogs. Yeah. So, but that's what I mean. Like, what was I gonna say? Yeah, like unfortunately, like it does have the risk of devolving into hipsterdom or like fake
Yeah.
transgression. Yeah, it becomes an art fashion thing, which I think like like what is a serious engagement with a lot of these ideas, even on an aesthetic level, and what is like something that is just like going to be like a fashion statement,
Yeah.
that will become, yeah.
I mean, we have LARPers, right, in the
Oh
space,
yeah,
right? People
definitely.
who they have like the right code, quote unquote, but they're not
It's an
I don't,
MMORPG for them to engage
yeah.
on online stuff. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and or I forget who it was. It might have been Aristo who did the like the fiefdoms, right, idea of
Yes, yeah,
Twitter, right?
yeah,
And that really resonates with me. And so, I don't when I think of like the people who are not content creators, but they're amplifiers, right? They're going to retweet your stuff. They're going to be,
yes,
they're going to like your stuff. They might like, comment on your stuff, but they're not like leading the charge, so to speak, or rallying the troops or doing any of that kind of stuff. That's fine, right? Those people need to exist in the ecosystem. I think this is another problem in the anon sphere is you have some people who are very, to your point, like elitist, and they're like, oh, like, but to me, it's like, no, you need good salt of the earth people who this is
yeah,
not their forte, right? But they're still going to help in that kind of that greater thing. We just need to understand there's a difference between those types of people and and who kind of who content creators are.
yeah, yeah. And that's unfortunate that there's like too many cooks in the kitchen, I feel. Yeah, but let's transition. Oh, but before we do that, like I wanted about one last point about Silicon Valley. It seems
Sure.
that like yeah, it's like that old essay that was written in the 90s, but of course like they were Marxists, so they sort of like had this critique of it. But that essay, The Californian Ideology?
I haven't read that one. No.
It was like a foundational text. It appeared in, I forget which magazine, but then eventually went into Wired magazine, about like how Silicon Valley is a strange mix of like libertarian ethos, sort of like it's the only last place where you can have this sort of like American robber baron transgressive business model, but also it's this strange eclectic mix of new age ideals around the capacity of human potential. This comes from the sort of Eastland Institute human potential movement that was around Big Sur in California. I mean, well, there was a lot of glow in the dark activity going on there, but it's like the sort of the Silicon Valley ideal of like new ageism, the age of Aquarius meeting like libertarian business model. And of course they would say like this is bad because we're Marxists, and it's like they don't factor in class, and these tech bros are going to like create reactionary whatever. But I think like there is a sense of that still, where like for example a lot of Silicon Valley people are sort of diving into like however muddle-headed it is, a lot of these like more spiritual ideals around the potential of consciousness and so forth. And I think that's quite fascinating because it really is, I think, one of the only spaces left to sort of have this like trailblazing American ethos in particular around like the capacity of someone to actually create value and to drive through limitations and so forth. I mean, that's a romantic view of it. There's a lot of, I mean, Silicon Valley is just as controlled as any other industry by the regime. But at the end of the day, there still is this like transgressive heart that maybe people like. I mean, Elon is very particular because in the one sense, he says things that are kind of like not our thing. Like he had that space with Vivek about immigration and pro-immigration, but then he does engage with like people he probably, in terms of optical value, probably shouldn't be engaging in on the timeline. But yeah, he's funny that way. But Silicon Valley in general is sort of like this weird expression of the global consciousness that is yet to be explored in full. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I love the noticing that Elon's doing, and I think again he's
Yeah.
doing it in a way that he's has plausible deniability, right?
Yes.
And
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
and this is the value, right? I talked about the biodiversity of ideas and strategies, right? Like Steven Saylor, right? He doesn't go hard in the paint on certain things, but he's very data driven, and he's kind of built
Yeah.
up a reputation, and so he becomes like a node in the network that Elon can kind of point people to, right? That
Yeah.
is going to kind of get people maybe to expand their mindset a little bit. And I think that's insanely valuable. But to your point, it was a great point about kind of tech being this innovative space. I think a lot of people see um once you've kind of been awakened, they it's like an early mistake to see this duality of like people who are awake versus not awake, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Of
There's
course.
no in between, right? And I know we're always like apprehensive to think about like, oh, that's a spectrum, right? But for me, I think that there's people on different levels, right? That they might, and I think like one of the things that also gets overlooked is a lot of people want to orient towards the good, right? We're just biologically, we resonate with the hero's journey, right? Like
Yeah.
trying to go out and make sense of chaos and move things in a positive direction. And sure, people's the way that they view the world, the lens that they have is going to color what they value and what they orient themselves towards. But I think that if you can break people, if you can kind of expose people in the right way to the right ideas, like they will come around to this kind of truth seeking goal. And I think that is largely what Silicon Valley has to do. Again, they have to live in the real world, because the real world is, like if you're going to make money, right? If you have to
Yeah.
provide value for people, you have to create a functioning company, right? You can't live in, la la land. I mean, the main problem is, the Fed was printing so much money that a lot of tech companies could live in la la land, right?
Yeah.
Because they
Yeah.
just had infinite
Exactly.
funding. But especially, I look at like the economic downturn as, sure, it's going to be hard on a lot of people, especially those who don't have assets, but it's also going to be very healthy because it's that culling, right? That filter is going to force, you're either going to have to gravitate more towards truth, or you're going to see your company fall out from under you. And so I'm optimistic that will in the long run be kind of a good thing for people to go to. Lastly, to kind of comment on Elon, I don't know how much you know about like the PayPal mafia and what Thiel and Andreessen and
Oh
Elon are
yeah, the Thiel
doing.
and Dreisen Horowitz network. Yes.
Oh
Yes.
man, I
Yeah.
love those guys. It was like one of my biggest kind of like you know um badges of courage that Andreessen followed me like when had like 2,000 followers or something
Oh
like
yeah.
that. And I think that they to your point earlier, right? Like
Or are
they're
you getting Thiel bucks Metaprime? Like,
well, so you talked about like the potential of grifting and
yeah.
people who put out content of like similar to mine can sometimes fall into the grift. All my stuff is free. It's all up on my website, or it's on my Twitter. And I might find some way to extract value from this
Oh yeah.
if I want to kind of um not have to worry about real world stuff, and something down the road. But I think that there's also like, if you put your stuff behind a paywall in a way that isn't egregious, right?
Well, that's what I do. Like,
People,
a portion of it is behind the paywall, but the
yeah,
most of it's free. Yeah.
and I respect that, because I think when I was tutoring, for example, right, I was in a very wealthy New England area where you can get like $300 an hour, and to me it was like that's crazy. Why
Yeah. For
why would you
just
charge
touring.
that?
Yeah.
Yeah, but at the same time, the people who are paying that, in their mind, like that, they wouldn't pay you $50 an
Yeah. They're
hour.
paying you for value. In other words.
Yes, and so they wanna feel like they're getting good value, and the way that you make them feel like they're getting good values, they pay for it. They pay
Yeah.
a premium price, and I think it's similar with content creation. It's like, if you're completely free, people are like, "Well, I could always look at it," or, whatever, but if they're paying for it, they're like, "Oh, I wanna consume that content," or, like, it's me putting my money where my mouth is, or
Yeah.
the fact that other people are subscribing and paying for this means that there's value there. And so for example, one of my good mutuals in the finance space, great guy, Peruvian bull. He He's kind of going through this problem now. He kind of became a micro celebrity because of the GME thing. He wrote a lot of really good stuff. He's got the
Mm,
whole end game, or the dollar end game. And he's kind of like, hey, I want to go into content creation full time, but I also, like, the community is very wary of people who then, try to leverage their, internet celebrity fame to kind of cash in. And
yeah.
he doesn't want to do it maliciously. He doesn't want to, like, start some kind of crypto scam and, like, buy a Lamborghini. Like, the kid wants to create content. But it's like, how do you do that in a way where people aren't going to accuse you of being griftery? It's difficult. You're always, any move you take, you're going to have people who
Yeah,
agree and
exactly.
disagree. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
but the bottom line with that is the PayPal mafia. Like, I think those guys, they care about humanity, right? They care about truth. And I think, like, they've actually been kind of, I've seen Elon, like, notice, Ben Braddock and, like, all of, like, a bunch of other kind of anon Twitter
Mm,
accounts. And, to me, whether, like, one of the big problems with being, like, someone like Trump or something like that is, like, you're not browsing poll, or you're not,
no,
like,
no.
and so and, like, you're relying on the people around you to give you the information that you need. And I think, like, the tech community, like, the PayPal mafia guys, they're much more willing to kind of, like, foray into these kind of darker corners of the internet and, like, hear about what's going on. And again, that robustness of truth, they're going to kind of
Yeah,
follow that.
even if optically it's not as ideal. Like, you mean,
Yeah.
like, some of the people in Dryasson follows, like, they retweet, oh well, that's a, I mean, yeah, but I mean, but then again, like, a lot of people would take umbrage to that because they figure, well, the PayPal people, they're just as, like, invested in their own, what their own, like, ulterior motives are than anybody else. And so, like, it's very, like, the sort of, like, shill for Thiel thing is a very powerful meme for a reason. I
Yeah.
mean, not because, like, it's very easy to, like, stick your opponents with, like, you're being paid by Thiel, you're taking the Thiel box. But no, I do think that, like, they are sort of an aberration compared to, like, a lot of other Silicon Valley people who are, like, more overtly, like, of the regime. So, but then they have to operate, like, in such a way as to not, like, piss off people higher than them. So I feel
Sure.
like I think, especially, like, people in the E-right, they just expect too much of them. They expect
Yeah.
too, like, you know what I mean? They expect, like, them to, like, totally transgress and just
Yeah.
fund the frogs. And yeah, yeah,
Yeah, exactly. And it's funny because when I think of Thiel, I was having this conversation with a bunch of my local friends yesterday because
yeah.
we were talking about LK99 and some other things like that. But we got on the topic of Thiel. And I don't know, you remember the story with Hulk Hogan, and was it like Gawker or something like
Gawker,
that?
yeah, just straight
Yeah.
Gawker that way,
Dude,
yeah.
that story is crazy, right? Because basically what happened is, Gawker, like, just lambasted Thiel and kind of put his private life on the internet.
Yeah.
And what one of the guys that he, because he does a lot of, like, really amazing philanthropy work, and he tries to help, put people through school and stuff like that. One of
Mhm.
these guys came and, like, pitched him this whole business idea of, like, we're just gonna do everything we can to take down Gawker. Really interesting book. It's called Conspiracy, that you can read on this. But, from what I understand, obviously you saw what Thiel did around Silicon Valley Bank, right?
Yeah.
Like, that was a big deal because people don't quite know. Obviously, it was like a Ponzi scheme, and they were basically getting these um, Silicon people to, these tech leaders, these founders, to raise rounds with them and then reinvest in the bank, and then they give them sweetheart loans and all this kind of stuff. But they would also set them up with, like, hires, right? So they were very
Yeah.
nepotistic hiring. But also, like, there's kind of, like, possibility that Silicon Valley Bank had connections with the Chinese, and they were placing a lot of these Chinese agents within these different Silicon startups and stealing their tech. So, like,
Yeah, and it was also a way of them to, like, invest similar to real estate to, like, get, corrupt Chinese businessmen to, like, hide funds from the CCP. Yeah, that
Mhm.
was another thing. Yeah.
Yeah. So, like, I think one of the things that's very white pilling to me is realizing that, the big, all the billionaires and the governments and stuff like that, they're not one big system that is just like blanketly trying to oppress people or do,
Yeah.
bad stuff. There's
Yeah.
a lot of factions that are vying for power. I mean, in the financial area, Jamie Dimon, like the CEO and JP Morgan, like, he's tooth and nail fighting against CBDC.
Mm.
It's a very interesting story. I don't know how much you know about this, but basically, the Europeans are extremely over leveraged. They printed a ton of these euro dollars, and so
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
interesting because a lot of people kind of hate on Powell, but Powell's actually, an interesting guy. He's the first guy of a who is not part of a very certain group of people who has been leading the Fed, and him
Mm.
raising
Hmm.
interest rates is actually putting a lot of squeeze on the Europeans, the Europors, right? And because they have all these
Well,
adjustable rate loans, and
well,
yeah,
especially
like,
with the war in Ukraine, like this, the American government's really been squeezing them. Yeah. So. Yeah.
and in my mind, basically what happened was, they're trying the city of or the city of London type of people are trying to push for
Hmm.
CBDC, right? Because they want more centralized control. And the reason that the European banks are so willing to go along with it is because they have just dog shit balance sheets, right? Like they are so in the
Yeah,
red, it's
they're beholden to the
ridiculous.
empire. Yeah, they're
Yeah.
beholden. Yeah.
But interestingly enough, after 2008, the US banks actually kind of got their shit together. I know this isn't like a popular take or kind of a well understood take, but they're a lot more structurally sound than I think a lot of people would give them credit for. And
Mm.
so, and it's guys like Jamie Dimon who are actually on the board of the Fed, right? Who, it's all of these US based banks who own the shares in the Fed. And so when the idea of CBDC was pitched to the Federal Reserve, what they didn't understand was that, like, none of these banks want to cut themselves out of the game, right? Like
No, of
JP
course not.
Morgan wants to stay involved, and
Yeah.
so they're going to fight tooth and nail to fight CBDC. And so there's all these people that are very doom and gloom about CBDC, and it's like, oh, the big banking cartels are going to run this over. There are actually very powerful contingents fighting against that. And again, I think it's a very big white pill, but it's, we're starting to see the rise of these people, and they're playing it smart. Again, going back to
Yeah.
like Elon, not going like full, frog anon kind of style on these things. Same thing with Jamie Dimon, right? He'll say like, I'm a red-blooded American capitalist, right? That's about as good as you can
That's
kind of
about
hope
as
for
good as
someone
you
like
can get
him.
in the banking
Yeah,
system. Yeah. Yeah. No, but I mean, even like Theo, like people don't realize, like, even if you're a billionaire, like you're still not above a lot of the power structure. They can still find ways to mess with you if you like press on certain buttons. I think like they're very consciously aware of that, and they have to operate under the assumption that like a Damocles is always over them. Even Elon. I mean,
yeah,
Elon has a lot of government contracts and all that with Starlink. But even him, like, I think he's more critical of like the war in Ukraine, the proxy war, than he lets on, but he can't, for reasons of his business, go all the way. I know, like, it's funny seeing like Nafo Dago people, like they're all being paid by the State Department, by the way. That they're like, Elon selectively cuts off Starlink because Elon's like, no, I don't want like, a missile to like be launched in the middle of Moscow. Like that's disastrous. I mean, the fact that Elon's like thinking of preventing World War III more than like people in the State Department is actually terrifying. It's like, it's like one of those things where it's like, wow, that's kind of, look how far we've gotten. But that's, another issue. I don't know what your stance is on that, but like,
sure.
you
Well,
you
I
should,
mean,
yeah.
yeah, again, like a little bit of a white pill, right? You had Biden would come out and say, "Oh, we're going to do this initiative. I'm going to send this money or whatever," and then you have the
Yeah.
Pentagon come out like the day later and be like, "Yeah, we're not doing that." And then
No, it can't.
Biden,
Yeah.
and then Biden would come out and be like, "Oh, I guess we're not doing that," right? Like the disconnect between kind of the federal administration and like the Pentagon groups and stuff like that, and like
Yeah.
the legit generals that are still kind of involved. It's amazing to see, and again, very white pilling because
Mhm.
like, sure, they're sending tanks and stuff like that. What they're really doing is they're sending all their shit weapons and their
Yeah.
like their bad tech so that they,
Overstock.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Like it's not as bad as it might look on its face, and I think that there's a lot of things to be positive about because again, there are people who, like, yeah, they don't want to see World War III. They don't want to, and then there's the whole UN thing of like, we're going to own like the American military. We're going to use it as like a global police force. Like
Yeah.
American military does not want that to happen. There's a lot
No,
of generals that
exactly.
do not want to hand over control of the American military to these kind of international groups. And so I think
Yeah.
the system is not as kind of corrupt and controlled as people think, and there's a lot to be optimistic about.
Yeah. I mean, and it largely is sort of a war by the State Department because the State Department is run by people that, well, without like saying it, have a, let's say, certain ancestral hatreds of the Russians for a variety of reasons. So, but anyways, um, let's move on to yeah. You wanted to talk about naturalism. What is this concept that you've sort of been shopping around? I was reading your thread actually that came after the premiere of Barbie. Oh my god, I don't want to talk about Barbie. We're gonna have to talk about Barbie a little bit. Um,
Yeah,
I did a
man.
whole stream with Prudentialist on this on our show, The Digital Archipelago. But I don't know. But yeah, I found your thread quite interesting because it started off on the wolves and sort of like the sort of natural patterns in terms of population control of certain invasive species, like the elk going crazy, and then you transition that into relations between men and women and how certain social technologies, if you view, for example, things like gender relations, I know this is like an NRX talking point, but if you view certain things like gender relations as a social technology, if you sort of create a sense of instability there selectively, this will lead to very harmful outcomes. And like the Barbie movie, of course, when it comes to gender relations, demonstrated this. I mean, whatever interpretation you want on it. But yeah, go ahead. I'm giving you the floor, so let's go from there.
Yeah, no, I did a space last night about this because I'm like on the verge of releasing this as kind of a articulated article that
Hmm.
people can then check out. So hopefully by the time this cast goes live, it'll be up. But
Yeah.
the idea of naturalism is, I think we talked a little bit about this at the beginning, that we have a lot of cool, awesome, truth-bound ideas in the anon space, but a
Yeah.
lot of times they come with the branding label of being kind of right wing or conservative. And that on its face is enough to get people to dismiss them offhand, right? Like I've had conversations with real life people, and they'll say, oh, I hate country music because it reminds me of Donald Trump and like Confederate flags and stuff like that. And so
Yeah.
they're not judging the country music itself, they're judging what it's associated with. And so I think it's very similar to the ideas. And so one of the ways that we get around that is we rebrand. We rebrand into
Mm.
something that's a little bit more palatable and doesn't have a pre-existing connotation. And you might say, oh well, that maybe that's disingenuous or manipulative, but I think that what I've talked a lot about truth and how we're actually really just trying to search for truth and common sense. And I think that's part of the game, right? Is
Yeah.
they split like the left leaning people, the right leaning people, and they kind of pit them against each other. But they're both necessary in the ecosystem, right? Conservatives like to conserve, and liberals like to innovate, and those things aren't inherently bad or good on their own, right? Like
Yeah.
you want to conserve the good stuff and you want to innovate and to adapt to the modern world. And so we need both of those sides to work together. It's similar to men and women, right? I think when it comes to like the whole dating thing, it's right now we have like basically the divine masculine and the divine feminine are in this like big fight where they just like can't get along. And
Yeah.
it's sad to see because obviously I want those two sides to kind of coexist in the harmony in that they can, right, that they have in historical times past. So we need to find a way of bringing that back. And so in my mind, what naturalism is when I meet people in the real world, I'll say I'm a naturalist, right? They'll ask me, conservative or liberal. I'll say I'm a naturalist, and they're like, okay, well, what does that mean? And just the fact that they ask that question is really healthy because it means they don't have a pre-existing connotation, and I can explain, right? And what I'd start with is, I believe that you've got the natural world, right? Sorry,
Yeah.
hold on. You got the natural world, and this is the foundation of reality, right? It's like we have to live in truth with nature. And so I believe in, that we should honor things like tradition and culture because this is wisdom that has been accrued over a long period of time, right? It's strategies for how to live in the world in a good way. And I also believe in, being healthy and working out and having good relationships inside your community and, trying to create like cooperative structures. And I believe that there's value in being competent and being able to provide for other people. And so if you say these things in this way, it's very hard for people to disagree, right? These are just kind of pretty basic fundamental things that I think if you presented them in this way, people would agree with. But this is kind of at the core of a lot of Anon philosophy, right? Like that's the cool thing is a lot of what we're, if you kind of, because, you might look at like the eating right, farm to table movement as very hippy dippy, right? It's
Hmm.
like that was kind of a left talking point in the past, and now it's a huge right wing thing. Well, what is the similarity between that and kind of like conservative traditional values? It's that these are naturally grounded things. These are things that are grounded in objective natural truth. And so if we define the ideology in that context and you say, look, like,
Yeah.
I don't believe in the right left dichotomy. I see a lot of value in people who are liberally minded because they're innovators, they're believers in free speech. And like, we need that kind of creative mindset. Another big thing that's kind of called for on Twitter is like, we need to create more stories. We need to create more mythos, right? More sculpture, like bring back like good art, right? Those people are left-wing people, right? And my problem, well, I think one of the limitations of, a non-Twitter identifying as right-wing conservative is you inherently
Or a
push
lot of
out.
other things that, yeah.
Yeah, is you inherently push out these groups. But if you say, hey, look, what we are just rational people that are grounded in who are grounded in nature, that's a lot more palatable to a lot of people. That's something that they can subscribe to. That's a banner that can kind of unite the clans, so to speak. And
Yeah.
so
Thank you for listening to the Content Minded podcast, where every Wednesday there are interesting guests, amazing ideas, solo streams, and discussions on a diverse array of topics from art, philosophy, history, and more. The free version will be available both here on YouTube and as a downloadable link on Anchor and Spotify, as well as on Substack. Each week, the full, uncensored, and spicier version will now be available on both Patreon and Substack, where you will have access to the full archive of both Content Minded and of Giant Reviews, where I break down interesting texts every week, including other exciting paywalled articles and good content. Thank you all. Please like, share, and subscribe. God bless. Goodbye. Help keep the content renaissance alive. Too sweet.